Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be taking a look at two specific chapters. So again, make sure you're reading chapters 22 and 21. Chapter 22 we're going to pick up in Europe, specifically in France. We see France at this time having elections where they actually elect Napoleon III, the nephew of the original Napoleon. And again, during his time in power, he's going to grow that power. By 1851, he's using the army, he seizes control of the government, and he actually gets the Constitution of France changed to give him 10 years in office. So again, kind of reassuring that he's going to have plenty of time to implement his plans. This is considered the Second Napoleonic Empire. And again, the government's going to be incredibly authoritative. He's the only one that's allowed to introduce laws. He's the only one that's allowed to declare war. And at first, this actually goes really well. The country is very prosperous. Napoleon III is using that money to kind of upgrade the country. The city of Paris is completely renovated. New boulevards, sewer, water, gas lines, all of these things kind of a modern city would need. So again, he does prove to be extremely popular, and he even starts to back off some of these authoritative aspects of his regime. He allows for trade unions. He allows for more input from the legislative branch. So again, he is genuinely quite popular in France. The one area where he's incredibly unpopular and what's eventually going to lead to his downfall is international affairs, specifically dragging France into wars that they end up losing. Once he is ousted from power, France is going to establish what we call the Third Republic. So basically their third time trying democracy. Now an example of Napoleon III's failure can be seen actually not in Europe, but over in Mexico. At this point in time, Mexico is having some disturbances, and several European countries send their militaries into Mexico to protect their economic interests. Now, once that rebellion is put down, the economy is safe, the European countries leave, except France. Napoleon views this as a good opportunity to obtain new colonies. So he's going to leave the French army there, and in fact, they install a guy named Archduke Maximilian as the new Emperor of Mexico. But as you can imagine, the Mexican people are not having any of this. They do not want a new emperor. And again, the French army there is very small. It is outmatched. It is outnumbered. It is quickly defeated. And again, Napoleon's extremely embarrassed by this. Again, you send your army to colonize what you consider kind of a third world country, and you end up losing. Sorry about that. Back in Europe, we see a major conflict called the Crimean War. Basically, this becomes a conflict between Russia and several other European countries, including the Ottoman Empire. Now, the reason why the conflict starts is that the Ottoman Empire, over time, is beginning to lose power. They're beginning to lose control of some of the outlying provinces that they've been in charge of. So as they start to lose control over these areas, other European countries are coming in and trying to gain control over these particular areas. And again, this really starts as an issue between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. But eventually, every major European country is going to get dragged into the conflict. Now, interestingly, they're not siding with Russia. So even though Russia is considered far more of a European country, even though Russia has similar, especially religious interests or comparativeness to other European countries, most European countries are actually going to back the Ottoman Empire, specifically because they don't like Russia. So again, it's kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? They're willing to back the Ottoman Empire even though they don't necessarily get along with them in general, because they simply don't want Russia to get any bigger, to gain any more strength. So again, you see Russia versus several other European countries. And again, Russia's going to lose. They're incredibly outmatched. They're embarrassed by the fact that their army was defeated so easily. And one of the things to kind of keep in mind about this war is it's really considered the first newspaper war, meaning that the things that happen on the front lines are telegraphed back to Europe that day. They're in that day's newspaper, the next day's newspaper. So again, it allows people throughout Europe to know exactly what is going on. And you really didn't see that with previous wars. But one of the things we see here in the Crimean War is it really redivides Europe. Again, if we go back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815, what Europe essentially did was create an alliance system, right? Nobody would start a major war because everyone was officially friends with each other. This war completely ends that, right? You have the two major empires of Europe at this time, Austria and Russia, on completely opposite sides of the war. And again, as these alliances go away, stability within Europe is also going to go away with that, which is going to give rise to new countries being formed. And we're specifically going to start with Italian unification. Now, Italian unification really comes about because of King Victor Emmanuel II and his prime minister, a guy by the name of Count Camillo de Cavero. And again, they're going to be the catalyst for this unification within Italy. Now, the parts of Italy that they want to unify are currently being controlled by the Austrian Empire. King Victor knows he has no way of actually defeating the Austrians in war. So if you can't defeat them yourself, what do? You get friends who can defeat them for you. And that's exactly what he does. He basically gets France involved and promises France a portion of his empire if they can defeat the Austrians. So France basically starts a war with Austria. They win the war. And again, King Victor now controls almost all of northern Italy. Right, at this point in time, it starts to really spark a nationalistic spirit within the country, right? You have all these people up and down the Italian peninsula that are being controlled by people that aren't necessarily Italian. So again, you start to see people rising up, specifically in the southern part of Italy. The Bourbon dynasty is still controlling the southern tip. Sicilia, places like this, they're overthrown, and that territory is actually turned over to King Victor. So again, not only does he now control the north of Italy, now he controls the south of Italy. The next area he wants to try to add to his Italian conglomeration is Venice, all right, the Venetian area. But again, he knows that a war against Austria is not going to be successful. So this time he sides with the Prussians. And within a few years, Prussia and Austria are going to go to war with each other. Now, anytime the Italians fight the Austrians, they lose. But anytime the Austrians fight the Prussians win. So because Prussia is the overall winner of the war and Italy is on their side, Venetia is turned over to the Italians. So again, we're getting a little bit closer. The only other part of Italy that is not under his control right now is what they call the Papal States. So basically in and around Rome. They're still independent and they're still protected by the French army. But again, as Napoleon III begins to have issues in France, he has to withdraw his army. King Victor is able to invade the Papal States and unify the country that is Italy. The next major country we see unify is Germany. And again, this is going to happen under King Wilhelm I and his chancellor, a guy named Bismarck. The first major thing we see is that there is a war with Denmark. You have Prussia and Austria on one side. You have Denmark on the other side. And again, Prussia and Austria are easily able to defend Denmark. And what they do is take a chunk of Denmark and divide it between the two. But Prussia does this knowing that they plan on taking Austria's part of that anyways. So once Austria's army goes back to Austria, Prussia just simply invades that part that was supposed to be Austria's, which now creates a war between Austria and Prussia, called the Prussian-Austrian War, surprisingly enough. Again, Prussia is able to easily win that war. It shows their military strength, and you start to see the southern German provinces side with Prussia. All right, the next thing you're going to see is that Bismarck basically tricks France into starting a war. In 1870, we're now going to see the Prussia-Franco War. All right, Prussia invades France. France is easily defeated. Napoleon III is actually captured. The city of Paris has to surrender. France is incredibly embarrassed. In exchange, Germany gets two provinces from France. All right, but what this shows is the strength of Prussia. And any remaining German municipalities that weren't already siding with Prussia now are going to side with Prussia, thus creating a unified Germany. So again, through war, through manipulation, through threats, again, Germany becomes a unified country. Now, around the rest of Europe at this time, specifically in Austria, what we see are more nationalistic cries. Again, Austria is an empire made up with dozens of different nationalities of people. The largest ethnic group within Austria are the Hungarians. So to make them as happy as possible, they actually create a dual monarchy. Hungary is able to make their own laws, have their own judicial system. They do still have to overall listen to Emperor Joseph, who's the head of Austria-Hungary. But again, they have a lot more freedom. So again, this works to make Hungary happy, but it only works up all the other nationalities within the country, right? Why should Hungary get this? We're stuck listening to everything Austria says. So again, it just makes these smaller nationalities within Austria want even more freedom. Over in Russia, again, they've defeated in the Crimean War, and it really shows how far they are behind their European rivals. So one of the things they're going to do is try to update their country, and step number one is getting rid of serfdom, which is essentially a milder form of slavery. Again, the idea is to bring them up to modern standards. It's only so effective. It doesn't exactly work. Most people still end up being serfs in some way, shape, or form. They do allow for more local control within government, again, taking away from that authoritarian aspect of the emperor or the czar of Russia at that time. But again, once people start to get a little bit of freedom, they want even more. And as the czar kind of pushes back on that, he's actually assassinated. So now his son takes over, and his son's like, well, if I gave you freedom and you killed my dad, I'm not even going to give you those freedoms. And he actually completely rolls back any progress that was made. And again, it kind of goes back to being an authoritative country. Great Britain is probably the European country that sees the least issues during this time. Again, they've created a parliamentary system that allows people to have a voice. And again, it might not be 100% voice. There is certainly an aspect of monarchy control within the country. But again, there is a system in place for groups of people to get things that they want in a nonviolent way. Again, if you jump across the Atlantic over here in America, the 1860s are going to see the start of the American Civil War. Now, one of the things that's going on in Europe at this time is still the Industrial Revolution. We learned about that in the previous chapter. But we start to see some new ideas come about, and specifically the idea of Marxism. Now, this idea is pushed by Karl Marx and Joseph Engels, who write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And essentially, this book lays out that what is happening right now is a class struggle. All right, it's been going on for centuries. The upper class versus the middle class versus the lower class, but the ultimate goal is to create a classless society that everyone in a country can share and benefit from the natural resources of that country. And that's really what they're going to be pushing with their whole idea of communism. Science also sees some major steps forward during this time. Louis Pasteur creates germ theory. So again, we start to understand a little bit more about why people are getting sick and thus how to stop them from getting sick. We see the periodic table being designed at this time. And Charles Darwin is going to publish his Origin of Species book. Now again, whenever there's change in society, we also see a change in art. The major art movement at this time is going to be called realism. And it's dealing with characters from everyday life. So again, previous artworks were, the dukes, the kings, the queens, the important people. Realism is going to show normal people, right? The butcher, the baker, the street sweeper, like these people that are just kind of everyday citizens and kind of showing the beauty in kind of everyday life. So that's chapter 22. So chapter 23, again, talking about the second industrial revolution, one of the things we're going to see is the creation of steel. Now, steel is better than iron in the sense that you can produce it cheaper, and it is even stronger. So again, it just allows you to build things bigger and build things on a cheaper level. You're also going to see the introduction of electricity. And again, by having electricity, it allows for a whole world of inventions. Light bulbs, generators, telephones, radios. All of that is feasible because we can harness the power of electricity. And the last thing is kind of the major invention at this time is the internal combustion engine, which is exactly what's in your car, right? So cars, tractors, ships, airplanes, anything running on an engine like that is able to be created because this engine now exists. Now, the ability of society to mass produce a product only works if there's people to buy a product, right? If you can produce 1 million whatever, you need 1 million customers to actually purchase those products. So what we see is that countries begin to fight with each other over customers. And again, you start to see markets expand. Places like Asia, Japan specifically. 1867, we're going to see railroads being built in Japan, factories being built in Japan, increased foreign trade. So again, the more countries you can interact with, the more customers you are going to have. By 1870, we see Germany replacing Great Britain as the leader of industry in Europe. So again, Germany as a country is really just starting out by 1870, and as a whole, they're already mass producing more things than the previous main country, which was Great Britain. Now, as industry grew, it became impossible to keep women out of the workforce, right? You need a certain number of workers. There are only so many men in existence. So again, you start to see more women in the workforce, specifically becoming very prevalent in business, right? As businesses get bigger, there's more paperwork, there's more filing, there's more typing. And again, at that time, those were jobs that were specifically kind of designed or led towards female workers. One of the other things you're going to see as more people end up in factories working is rise of political parties that are kind of catering to them, specifically socialist political parties. We talked about Marxism there in the previous chapter. The major political party we see is the SDP, the Social Democrat Party in Germany. They're able to win a majority of the seats, and they start to push for governmental change. By 1912, they are the largest political party in Germany. So again, lots of power, lots of influence. Populations around Europe also grow at this time. One of the major reasons is we see an increase in the birth rate. Everyone's having more children. A couple reasons. One, better medicine. When people get sick, you can actually cure them as opposed to people simply dying. And also cleaner conditions. Talked about the idea of germ theory in the last chapter. Again, people understand what is making them sick, thus they can avoid it, thus they live longer and have more children. Also at this time, you start to see more and more people moving into cities. But cities do start to have some improvements, right? We have clean water being brought into cities. We have sewer systems to get the bad things out. And we also start to see the first government buildings for housing, right? Prior to this, every single thing was private enterprise. Build houses, sell them to people. But quite frankly, people couldn't keep up with that. You needed something as large as a government to mass produce these houses for the large number of people moving into cities. Class system also kind of begins to change at this time to some extent, right? The upper class has always been the landed, wealthy gentry within a society, but now you start to have these business tycoons, people that weren't born into wealth, that gained wealth themselves. And again, you start to see these two groups intermingling. The people with the land have the fancy titles, the dukes, the lords. The people with the money have lots of money, but they want those titles. So what you start to see is lots of marriages between these two groups. So that way the money and the title go hand in hand with each other. All right, the middle class at this time is everyone from doctors and lawyers, business owners, small business, white-collar jobs are all considered middle class. The lower class is still going to be the largest portion of that population. Again, about 80% of people fall into this lower class. We're talking landless farmers, we're talking artisans, unskilled workers. All of these people are considered lower class at this time. The other major change we see is kind of the family structure of this time. Middle class and upper class people are starting to have less children. This, combined with cheaper labor for things like nannies and maids, means that women of that ilk have a lot more free time. Right? They can go to school, they can get an education, they can read books, they can join clubs, they can push for social issues. Again, where women were having to do all the housework and raise all the children, less children, no housework, gives them a lot of free time. Working class people tended to find themselves getting higher wages, which meant more women were able to stay at home. You didn't need both parents working because the husband could simply make enough money. And we do begin to see new laws keeping children out of factories, right? Compulsory education, making sure everyone attends schools. Again, the government starts to make standards for these schools. We start to see more people getting into education as a career. And again, society saw this as a way to get a higher education within society, which should equal more skilled laborers. And again, the idea too in school is that you can use that schooling to educate kids to respect the government, to become patriotic. So again, school kind of serves a dual purpose within society. This new level of education and literacy leads to more newspapers being produced, right? Again, in England, Scandinavian countries, literacy basically doesn't exist. So now you have millions and millions of people who are able to read. So again, you give them something to read. So again, we see newspapers being produced. We have lots of new ideas. All those different kinds of things are coming to the forefront. We also have people with enough actual free time to sit down and read a newspaper. And it leads to something that they call mass leisure. The idea that people have free time, people have weekends off, They're going to take a vacation. They're going to go to the beach. Sports become a major thing, especially in places like England. Rugby, soccer, all of these are going to pop up at a professional level during this time period. Looking back into Europe, we see democracy in Europe, which countries have it, which countries don't. Again, Britain by far allows for the most democracy, right? The most number of citizens with a voice within their country. France is still a bit of a struggle, right? We don't have Napoleon anymore. We have the Third Republic. But basically it breaks out into a mini civil war, right? You have some people pushing for a bicameral legislature. You have some people pushing for the restoration of a monarchy. So again, France is still a little bit torn. Italy, we have the country unified, but it doesn't go quite as well as people expect, right? People aren't necessarily into it. Yeah, they're Italians. Yes, there's now a country called Italy, but there's not a lot of participation in government. Germany has created a bicameral legislature. Again, they're trying to make the masses happy, give the masses a voice. But again, this still is a monarchy, and all the power still lies with the emperor. Austria-Hungary, again, has divided power between them and Hungary. But one of the major issues we have in the empire is that everything's done in German. Right? The problem is the German speakers are actually a minority within the country. So again, only a third of the citizens actually have a German background. So again, you have all of these other minority groups questioning why that group is in charge, why that group gets to make all the decisions. Over in Russia, we talked about the assassination of the Tsar. His son takes over, Alexander III. Again, no new reforms. We're going to increase Russification, which is basically making people want to be Russian. Again, Russia is a huge country, lots of different nationalities within that country. But again, trying to get people to buy into the concept that we're all the same. But again, actual Russians only make up about 40% of the country. So again, not exactly a successful thing to get people to buy into that. So that is our look at chapters 22 and 23.